So the first question that I thought we talked about today is starting with Ellie. If you could talk about your findings, or more broadly with the group, your research and experiences about the intersection of identities and learning about climate change. So the title of our webinar is How Does Political Identity Shape How Learners Engage with Climate Science? But something that really emerged for me in reading the article was that these students came in with sort of their surface identities, for example, being a rush baby, but then through ethnographic methods, we were able to see that they actually had multiple identities that were surfaced and leveraged to help them make sense of climate change data. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I go too far into talking about the findings, I definitely want to acknowledge that this work was done as part of a Gates Foundation funded project, which was led by Phil Bell at the University of Washington when I was a graduate student there. And the work in this paper was done with Blakely Surasaki, who's the co-author. So the three students that we talk about in this paper, two of whom are from conservative Republican families, Luke and Timothy, and then one from a liberal family, Gareth. They all had different ways that they were negotiating who they were and who they wanted to be in relation to the science, but also just in relation to their social status or their social standing in the class, or being interested in science, or being Democratic or Republican. So I think the key findings about identity in the classroom that I would want to highlight, the first is that because there were so many different identities that came into play, we actually found that allowing students like Luke and Timothy, who came in pretty conservative and sure climate change was not happening, that it was a political thing, not a scientific thing, allowing students to experience these moments of identity dissonance where science and school and political identities did come into conflict, and doing that in a supportive atmosphere where students were allowed to pursue these conflicts and attempt to resolve them. That was critical for the students, and that this dissonance between these different identities was actually productive from a disciplinary identity development standpoint. And you asked earlier about taking this culturally responsive approach to climate change, and that's what we had tried to do with the curriculum that we were piloting here. And what was interesting was when we were analyzing and reflecting on this, it wasn't for Luke and Timothy, just about us providing them pathways, of interest or relevance into the material. They really had to, for themselves, decide if they even wanted to become that type of person who thought climate change was happening. That was an identity, almost decision, there was an identity consequence for them. So we have to think about, in curricular design, when we use these culturally responsive pedagogies, supporting youth and building these bridges between home and school, that there's also a question for the students of, do you even want to walk on that bridge, right? Or is it ultimately too big of a personal threat or consequence to your family or to your political self to even take that step? So these different multiple identities that come into play in the classroom, there's kind of two sides to that bridge that we have to think about. And then the other kind of last identity piece that I would mention that we can talk about more later if it's of interest is thinking about the students' understanding of their and human society's place and agency in respect to these processes that happen on different time scales. So how you construct identity not only on different time scales, so in a moment in a classroom or across your life or as part of a society, but also in relation to time scales. So how do you understand yourself as able to be an actor who can shape a process that's occurring on what we have for a long time thought of as geologic timescales versus things that are now happening very quickly. So for topics like climate change, thinking about identities in relation to time and timescales may be more important than what might come up in other kinds of science. So those are kind of the three ways that I was seeing multiple identities surface and being negotiated as students were working through this curriculum.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It sounds like there's a lot of challenges that come into the constraints of a typical classroom period, whether it's 50 minutes or a 90-minute block, to think about identity change, surfacing multiple identity changes, and then thinking about time for both the individual, but also time of the earth in multiple scales. So Dr. Henderson and Dr. Sezemberry, what are your experiences with working with students' multiple identities and also teacher multiple identities as you're going through professional development? And I am curious if you find students are more willing to walk that bridge than maybe adults who may have, I don't know, more solidified identities in their communities.
So, I mean, different things, I would say. So there's probably differences, you know, in terms of when you look at the time scale and the agency, when you're a student, you know, middle school students, when you see, oh, the impacts can be influential on me versus, oh, you know, I'm going to die soon. This is really not going to impact me. So what I see in terms of like my research, it's kind of like thinking about what Ellie said. When I talk to teachers, they would be, so there's two different view among teachers. And some of them were like, I'm a science teacher, I'm a chemistry teacher, I'm a science teacher, and I would teach this just as science. So I'm not going to even talk about my own identity. I don't want to bring about any of the social, cultural, or political aspects of this climate change issue to my classroom, even though this teacher accepts the idea that human impact is important on climate change. And then there's another teacher who says, it is important to engage my students into those conversations, and I will have those negotiations like it happened in the classroom that was described in the paper. So I see a lot of differences in the teacher identities and how they want to create that atmosphere. So I was going to actually kind of ask Ellie a question here about creating that supportive atmosphere. Like how is teacher, like one thing that mentioned in the paper is to have the idea that teacher doesn't really share you know, his own identity or what he thinks exactly about climate change at the beginning, but then at one point it makes it, you know, it becomes more explicit to the students. So I get a lot of questions like that from the teachers that I work with, like when and how to express our own views about climate change to the students. So I was wondering, like, what was the teacher's role there? Because to me, that's a really tricky point in creating that atmosphere. And then related to that, I'm also wondering, how did the design team, like the people who designed the curriculum, had any impact on creating that atmosphere?
Yeah, that's a great question. The teacher positioning is so important. So in this particular case, you know, it was the teacher's decision how he wanted to broach that with the students, and he decided because that he would rather hold off on saying what he thought about climate change, especially in those initial discussions where he was really trying to elicit what the students thought. So I think it's a little bit depends, I would say, on the teacher's relationship with the students and how comfortable you feel that like you sharing would elicit their sharing, or would your sharing kind of shut down what some of your students might be thinking. So I think it's especially in different classrooms, I would probably take pretty different approaches to how I would kind of as myself position myself as a teacher. And then in terms of the curriculum design, the thing that we did was we started with the curriculum. In addition to eliciting prior knowledge, we had students watch videos of people in the media talking about climate change and had them break down some of the evidence and the argumentation used. There's a lot on argumentation in this particular curriculum. So break down the evidence, think about, was it scientific? Was it not? Where was it coming from? How credible was it? But that at least served to get a whole bunch of ideas on the table. Because my opinion is, and I think, you know, this is pretty well backed by sociocultural ideas, is that, you know, those sociocultural ideas, that media, it's in the classroom whether or not you talk about it. So as the teacher, being there to help students think about things seems a little bit more effective than only teaching the science and standing back and then letting students kind of sort through all the other stuff on their own.
Well, thank you. And I agree with the idea that, like, you set the norms, and what is the norms of a science like climate science? I mean, and I'm saying this like climate science because over the 6 years that I've been getting more and more into climate science education research, I also realized that the nature of data, or the norms, the scientific norms that students are used to, are not always exactly like the data that we have in climate science. You know, like, even one of the things you emphasize, like, you know, looking at that data temporally and then think about the impacts of it later on. But even just making sense of that data in relation to the big claims that we have is much more complicated. And then, you know, some of the case studies where you discuss how students kind of pull up the multiple lines of evidence and then say, oh, actually, you know, you might be right. Now I'm agreeing more with you. So that kind of, like, I guess, was helping there to the teacher and the, you know, and the whole classroom atmosphere to make that shift, because that's important, like being able to see that shift, right?
So, like, as we're all talking, I'm thinking about my friend David Long's work in his ethnography of evolution education, and you know, the way in which science, or particular types of science or scientific claims, can be threatening to people's deeply held identities, their understanding of the world. In that case, you know, evolution was challenging people's understanding of what happens to them after they die. And thus was often rejected because it meant kind of resurfacing your understanding of the world, or the kind of system of meaning. Climate science happens this way. There are particular science findings that are enrolled in these kind of more controversial discourses. Gun control research is a good example of this. Vaccine science, genetically modified organisms. It's not kind of necessarily all science. There is a lot of science, to use kind of Bruno Latour's term here, it's kind of normalized in society, right? Like, we don't talk much about pasteurization as controversial. Although I'm sure there certainly are movements that would challenge me. And, you know, one of the things that we did in some of the research that I'm going to present at AERA and AAG coming up in the next couple of weeks is, you know, what about teachers who are hostile to it? What decisions are they making? What happens in those classrooms? And kind of what are those dynamics like, right? So in this paper, you already had a teacher who was sympathetic to including that science. And we know that even if your state has standards, that doesn't mean necessarily teachers are still kind of have agency and are capable of making decisions about what is and isn't included in the classroom. So there's a kind of like variegated pattern of implementation here. Like, who's actually doing climate science? What do those teachers care about? What are their kind of political priors? And then how does that impact student learning, student engagement? Like, I would love to go into a classroom and study kind of a climate denier teacher and climate science denier teacher and see what happens in that space. Catherine Stevenson, who's at North Carolina State, has done some of this work and has found, and I think it's not ethnographic work, but it's survey work, looking at whether or not teachers' beliefs, personal beliefs, translate to student learning. And she has found that they don't. That the kind of but that's, you know, that's one study. There's more work to be done in that regard. So I think we need to take seriously teachers' political and cultural commitments as well, right? Evolution education, I think, is really instructive here, right? There's been a decades-long process to kind of deal with the issue of public misunderstanding of evolution, and we've barely moved the needle on that. And I think that's really interesting to think about the limitations there. I don't know, we could talk about whether this is a similar or different issue, but
Yeah.
that's what I'm kind of interested in. And what I really like about this paper is that students are very much trying to figure out their identity. Like, it is kind of less baked into the cake, or maybe less rigid, but you know, giving that space for them to do that work, I think, is a really important thing to do. And to not, I think it's also really complicated, and I like this paper for that reason. there's this open question, I think, and something that I know people are struggling with is like, is it possible to kind of disentangle someone's identity from what is known by science? Or is science going to kind of always threaten particular identities, and we just have to be okay with that? I mean, you look at the history of scientific findings, it's threatened religious identities, it's threatened, in this case, political identities, economic ideologies, things like that.
Something that stands out to me with this curriculum design, as Ellie was talking earlier, in the beginning, they did bring controversy into the classroom, but then I thought the curriculum took a slightly different approach in that it actually engaged students with primary data around climate science in a way that positioned them as experts. So for example, Luke's intersection of wanting to be a scientist, he really engaged with the data and then the social argumentation, so the practices of science, I think helped him cross that bridge to accepting data. I think the traditional approach for climate science or science education in general is for us to share the claims and also the evidence that go with the claims. But it seems in this sense, the students were generating their own evidence from models, raw data, and also the help with experts. It really stood out to me, just as Joseph was talking about who these experts are and who holds weight in contemporary society. We had Madeline come into the classroom who helped also shape Timothy's identity as an expert and make sense of some of the data that he couldn't make sense of himself. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how students engage with meaning making around data and climate science information, if you think that also impacts their identity.
Yeah, and actually connected to that, and also connected, I think, to the conversation that was just going on, I was thinking about work that I've done. I've done ethnographic work with climate scientists, and I've been working with them for nine years now. So I just followed up with everybody again, and this is work I'll be presenting at ICLS. And one of the big changes from when I started working with them to now is they're all much less willing to talk to the general public. That might be an overstatement, but there's a trend towards being less willing to talk to the general public, both whether or not you think climate change is happening, because either people feel like they're preaching to the choir, and people are not as interested in knowing the details of the science necessarily. And again, this is the impressions that the scientists have had. I already think this thing. Sometimes, if think climate is happening, I might think it to an extreme. I might over attribute things to climate change. Going back to what you were saying about, about having teachers who think that climate change is happening, but don't know, aren't able to then respond to the evidence against it, kind of in that same vein, but in terms of over attributing things to climate change. And what some of these scientists were talking about, because of that, they were very critical of, I think a lot of us are, about how we're getting information now in social media, and how over the past 9 years, that's something that has really changed in terms of how we're interacting with scientific information in a way that seems to be perpetuating some of these political polarizations that we're seeing. And they're calling for, in the interviews that I just did, more engagement with data, less coverage and longer form coverage, where people are able to engage more deeply. Things like what the New York Times does, where they sometimes allow you to go in and manipulate, data sets and kind of create your own things, like that kind of thing, with more of a story and narrative format to it. And I think that's exactly what we saw being successful in the classroom, was engaging with the data, being able to build a meaningful story. They had to create an infographic where they communicated to their community something about climate change and its impacts. And the thing that we really saw, one of the things, is that it took revisiting the data and different kinds of data multiple times over an extended time period, and in order for you to kind of figure out what you thought about it and understand, if we look at Timothy, is this a 1,000,000-year cycle? that's a great hypothesis, right? Like, that's a great idea. Like, let's explore it. But you can't explore that in 50 minutes, right? You need to come back to it over time. So some of these, whether it's working directly with data and creating evidence yourself, whether it's learning experiences that take a little bit longer, you can come back to over time, experiences that are more in-depth or more narrative structured, that provide some of these ways of kind of more deeply engaging with data and with the social and human impacts. These things seem to be helpful. The issue that I always think about when I look at this paper and I'm like, wow, that's great, they changed their mind. And then my next thought is, okay, how do we possibly scale this, right? If, I get people all the time saying to me like, how do, this is very interesting. How do we do this on a whole societal level, right? And if you look at kind of the level of engagement that it took for students and the army of people that were there, researchers and teachers and other students and scientists coming in, it becomes kind of a challenge to think about what does this look like on a larger scale.
So, Ellie, on the idea that, like, when you talk about the time that's given in the classroom to be able to explore the timeline of climate change, which is huge, right? And it's really important to really understand the big claim. So that was like, and that was one of the topics kind of like we decided to talk about. And it's really interesting to me because I'm just seeing on one single case study that there's this one pre-service teacher who went to like variety of workshops and different classrooms that teaches climate change, part of that, course, part of that workshop. She was engaging more and more, and that kind of like grabbed my attention to understand why she's more engaged and more interested, because that's the way to learn that. That's the way to be able to explore that huge data set. Like, it's impossible, as you said, to really grasp this on a 50-minute long lesson, or if it is just like a one course, one shot workshop idea. So when I looked at that one pre-service teacher, what I was recognizing also, like, where the people that she works with, like, or talks with, when she goes and talks with like her parents or the teachers that she worked with, and they talk about like what are going to be the impacts of climate change in the future for them. And when she keeps hearing, oh, like it's not going to be a big impact in our timeline, she kind of gets like disengaged. And she says, I really wanted to learn this, but I also feel like talking to these people, they see it's not important. And I just feel like I have to first go through this big struggle to understand it is important. And then when she goes, like, works with middle school students as a part of her internship or the project that she gets engaged in, she kind of sees a completely different thing, because she realizes, like, this youth thinks the climate change impacts are very important. It's on a timeline that might possibly impact them. So she comes back and says, well, now I'm feeling much more hopeful. I want to learn even more, because I feel like there is a kind of population, which is our youth, who understand this is important. And this puts me as an important role as an educator. So that kind of like shifts her whole agency around, like going and at least learning about climate change even before doing anything about it. But at least like in terms of engaging herself into various activities, workshops, and courses to put the pieces of the puzzle together herself. Because as you said, when you try to like scale this up, not a lot of people will be within a project where climate change will be taught extensively within one course maybe.
And I guess I have a question about whether it's going to evolve over time, and we might see more of what you're seeing if people are starting to recognize these impacts as already happening. So I guess I would be curious about what you've seen with the teachers, and do you think this teacher would recognize that as an impact that would impact her, or is this distance, right, this time distance that we've seen for decades now when you kind of ask people about climate change, do you still see that holding?
Larry Hamilton, who's a friend who's at the University of New Hampshire, has done some really interesting sociology work on kind of proximity to extreme climate events, and has found actually that it doesn't matter, that people are less likely to attribute those to climate change, that the bigger variable in the way they understand those is partisan ideology. So partisan ideology overwhelms even the visceral experience of extreme weather from climate change, in the same way that it overwhelms religious identity. It's a kind of stronger identity marker for a lot of people, for very highly motivated kind of reasoners. I guess, and also I'm reminded of some analysis that we did that we still need to write up. There's this way in which, like, if you think of climate change as a story, right, that kind of shapes and narrates people's lives, or not, different people are going to engage with it in different ways. I'm often really interested in this like where did it even come from? Like, why we never talk about the kind of like genesis or the origin of climate change as a colonial project. If you look at, so I teach climate change now in the context of an upper level sustainable development class, right? And in order to understand sustainable development, you have to understand like why some countries have, quote, developed and why others are, quote, undeveloped or developing. And that's deeply rooted in the history of colonialism, in the history of racial capitalism. There are industrialization, and a lot of those, especially for people of privilege, a lot of those processes are hidden from us and are kind of hidden by space and time. And what's the implication of that, right? So, you look at like the causes of climate change, it's primarily people in wealthy societies who are consuming lots and lots of carbon. How does a science teacher engage with that kind of social reality? And I don't know that science education is necessarily good at that yet. And nor do we really train or ask science teachers to have that kind of critique or understanding. We just published a piece in the International Journal of Science Education that kind of traced teacher identity through to student learning using some work on conceptual mobility. And we found actually that the teacher was kind of backgrounding those questions, that she was doing a really good job of showing the evidence and talking about like, how do we know climate change is happening? What are the mechanisms? But absent from that was any sort of like, okay, like now what? Now what do you actually do? And once you make that switch from like the pure science or the evidence, you're asking teachers and students to then make claims about how the future world should be structured, right? What ought we to do? And when you're in the land of ought, you're in values and ideologies and the creation of different futures. I mean, I was really happy to see some of that work in the theory here. And not everybody's engaged in the same futures project, and some people resist knowledge because it conflicts with their futures project. So I think that's really rich terrain for people to do work on. And I think that's certainly where I'm going. I mean, I do a lot of work with rural conservatives and first generation college students from rural areas. And the conversation around climate change is somewhat similar. It tends to be, you say the word climate change and it's enrolled in this kind of partisan discourse. And on the one hand, we can see that maybe as a bad thing. And on the other hand, maybe that's productive, right? Like, why is it that people disagree on these things? Political differences are not just like, oh, you think this way and I think this way. Like, there's real material struggle there, right? Like politics is how we decide who gets what. And I think that's, some of the European researchers that do work on this don't look at this kind of like, they look at it from an agonistic perspective of like, how is political disagreement productive? That's a lot to ask a science teacher, I think, to do.
So also, like, I definitely agree on the impact of the political disagreement and even, shaping the beginning repertoire of students when they're coming into that classroom.
this is then what ties into the policy piece, which I think you were getting at a little bit, Joe, about how do we make decisions, excuse me, how do we make decisions based on uncertain future, right? And how do we do that in a way that is sustainable when we don't know exactly what's going to happen? And starting in the 90s with the UNFCCC, the first climate change conference, they decided that not knowing what exactly would happen is not a reason not to act. Now, we can argue about whether or not we have upheld that or let ourselves be held back by uncertainty. But I think there's this tension between the science, which has an inherent uncertainty to it, and then political action and political argumentation where you're trying to do something. And that has been an ongoing issue with climate change policy, which I think also affects how learners understand climate science. And I want to just follow up on the point that you brought up again about this idea of colonialism and development and some of these power issues that are in play in climate change. And I think it's always really interesting to look at what kind of has been happening and who's been impacted for a long time, like say indigenous communities in Alaska, who've had erosion and severe weather problems similar to, say, a Sandy type situation, though not the same weather phenomenon, but with similar impacts, but one is much more high profile than the other. Or areas of the world that are already water resource strained, but that, the average person wouldn't have really heard about. So kind of what impacts are we hearing about? Who's deciding what's important to take action on? And also what the science of climate change is shaped by these power dynamics as well. We don't have long historical records that are valued by Western science in large parts of the world, from Africa or from parts of South America. We don't have existing, observed temperature records going back the same period of time. So the science itself and the certainties in our projections have those same issues of colonialism, of power, of what counts as evidence in the science. And it's a little bit of a different can of worms, but I think it kind of is another way of illustrating the complexities of how the science is related to social development and social power, and then ultimately decision making and action on climate change.
Right, and there's this thing, I've written and published a lot on kind of neoliberalism in environmental education, science education a little bit. And I think one of the things that I notice a lot in climate change curriculum is this way in which there's this kind of like responsibilization of solutions. So we often talk about like, well, buy different light bulbs or buy a hybrid car. And there are these very almost individualistic responsibility. And, if you look at like what actually causes, like what the big drivers of carbon emissions are industrial processes, large scale production processes of energy production and things like that are like even the way in which we talk about solutions is kind of enrolled in this political imagination. And so there's this like, on the one hand, you want to tell students like do good individual, like be in ethical consumption, think about your local place, but scaling that up and really looking at these issues at scale, really affecting this at scale, those are policy issues. And that's where people are going to get into disagreements depending upon which political kind of group you identify with. And I mean, I think this is all made much, much harder by the increasingly partisan nature of American society. And kind of the political scientists talk about this in terms of negative partisanship, which is a fun term to Google and go down that one. But yeah, I don't know. I actually think climate change education is getting harder and harder.
I was thinking that this would be a good transition point for us to maybe think about where the future of climate change learning and research can be situated. So we have the classroom, the political sphere, and across settings. But also, Ellie, if you want to finish your thought before we shift to the new question.
Oh, no, it's fine. I can spin it into where the future of climate change education should be going. Well, I was going to say one thing. You see a lot of work done in science communication around climate change in the media, and then you see a lot of work, growing amount of work, science education, climate change in the classroom. And what you don't see as much of is how learning spans multiple contexts and multiple different ways that people learn about climate change. So how do we think about social media? How do we think about it, a classroom? How do we think about the fact that a student both participates in social media, consumes social media, and also is in the classroom, right? So kind of, I think, more cross-context work and thinking about students and learning and adults and learning more holistically is across all the different contexts is important. How is the family down the street learning about climate and energy in their everyday life, right? We have a lot of survey work. We don't have a lot of ethnographic work or other work that is just happening in everyday communities. There's participatory work that's being done, which I think is a great direction for us to go in terms of understanding the needs of communities and how we how people are making sense of climate change in their lives. So I see kind of this opportunity for us to better study what's actually happening with climate change in addition to developing interventions for classrooms. So I would like to see us moving to thinking more deeply about some of these issues of who is learning about climate change, who is getting to make decisions, whose voice are we hearing, how do we better understand what the needs of communities are through some of these methods that I think learning scientists have in their tool belt. And how can we then support this equitable decision-making around climate change?
So I'm going to comment on the ethnographic research piece because I think that was really important to see this kind of work. For me, like this is telling me how that shift can happen rather than, this shift happens or what people think right now, but it really gives me a story of how this shift can happen in the classroom, and then gives me an idea when I'm designing a program, a curriculum for the teachers to kind of think about that piece and give them a suggestion based on what can happen and how it can be happening in the classroom. So and in relation to that, I like, ethnographic discourse studies, looking into the details of the discourse, like ownership of the ideas, because sometimes when students talk about impacts, like who do they owe it to? Like they talk about it, for themselves sometimes, and they kind of like talk about it as others' problem, or this can impact like their feelings and emotions at times. So looking at more like in-depth discourse analysis of how people explain climate change and the impacts and their agency about it, I think is going to be important work around climate change education. And another thing I'm really interested in recently is to use interactional ethnography approach and to look at how the design teams impact the decisions of the teacher, of the instructor or the teacher who's going into the classroom. The meetings that the design team and the scientists have with the teachers kind of shapes the classroom discourse, and then that classroom discourse can be reshaped by the student identities. Because there's, and in this paper too, we're seeing, when students work with the scientists and the research team design a certain curricula, like understanding the impacts of that structure can also be important and give us ideas on like how the teachers and instructors are taking that to their classroom.
Like we need to get people to understand climate change, and like environmental education has this long history of like, if only people understood environmental issues, they would change their behavior. And like, it just doesn't, that's failed over and over and over again. And so people are kind of like, okay, so like, now what? Like, what are the limitations of the educational project here, and how, towards like, what are we working towards? What's the goal of our work here? I mean, I think there's an ethical goal, right? Like students are going to be, dealing with this issue, there's an ethical imperative that they understand one of the largest processes that's going to shape their lives going forward.
I think that's a great question to leave us thinking about, especially as I'm sure many of us are heading into AERA research. So I really wanted to thank Ellie and Asla and Joseph for joining in on the panel discussion today and for letting me moderate.
Well, thank you, Veronica, for moderating, and Ellie, thank you so much for writing this piece.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It's really good. I was really happy to see it in a journal like JLS, so thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the JLS editors for putting this together and having us here for this discussion.